right, so let's talk about the tools that we're going to be using. If you have a beginning pottery tool kit, these are the implements that come with it. And some of these we won't use at all. They're absolutely not necessary for this project. If you are to take a ceramics class either here at MCC or somewhere else, you would end up using all of these tools. But we won't use all of these tools. So if you have one, great, use it. If you can borrow one, great, do that. But you don't necessarily have to go out and buy it. So I'm going to show you how these tools work, and I'm also going to show you how you can substitute with different tools. The first thing you have is your cutoff wire, and this is what we use to cut into our clay and cut off chunks of clay. You could very easily substitute dental floss for this. So if you don't have a cutoff wire in your toolkit, or if you don't want to buy a toolkit, you can substitute with dental floss. You get a sponge. Any sponge will do. If you have these little cheap makeup sponges, you can get a whole pack of these for $1 at the dollar store. You can use those, or you can just use a kitchen sponge. Any kind of sponge will do. So that's a substitute for that. These you don't really need at all for this project. These are handy just because they can be used as implements for smoothing. But this metal rib is really kind of going to be the workhorse of what we're going to be doing. We use this to smooth our slabs. We use it to build up our coil project. And I know a lot of these terms don't mean anything to you, but they are going to as you watch this video. So this metal rib, as opposed to this is our wood rib, and this is just our wood angular tool. These we could live without. But this one we can't. And so if we need to substitute for this, this is a paint scraper that I got at Harbor Freight. That was really cheap. That will substitute for a rib. Here's my Costco card, my old Costco card. This makes a great rib, and so we can use this to scrape and smooth and to lift things up. And so it's a great substitute for our metal rib. You could even take your scissors and cut it if you felt like you needed it to be round because you're working on a round form. Just go ahead and cut that to whatever shape you need. Here's my old AAA card. I have an old library card that I use. You can also use kitchen spatulas, and you can get these at the dollar store. This one is a bit softer, so this would be nice for smoothing, and you might want to break this handle off, but this would be nice for smoothing. But this came from the dollar store, and this is more rigid, and this is great for scraping, and it makes a great substitute for your rib. So, oh, one other thing, the lid off of margarine tubs and things like that, you can cut that with scissors, and you can make a rib with that as well. So you're going to definitely want some sort of scraper. You're going, if you don't have this metal rib that comes with the beginning kit, then use any one of these other things to find a way, and maybe a variety of these to find a way to substitute for that metal rib. I would also say a big spoon could also be used as a scraper, but it's such a small surface that it's not a good smoother, and that's where things like these old credit cards and library cards and Costco cards are great for smoothing. So if you have a spoon for digging and contouring, you may need to couple it with a credit card that you use for smoothing and scraping. So you may need to use both of them. You're going to see later in the video, I'm going to show you, I use an old wooden spoon, and I use this to paddle the clay. And when the clay starts to set up, we're going to talk later about the different stages of clay. When it's really, really soft, if I try to paddle it, it's just going to collapse on me. But as it starts to get some structural integrity, I can use this to quickly paddle something into shape when I'm working on it. So an old wooden spoon is great for that. Even just a piece of wood, a 1x3 or something like that, can be used. This hard spatula could also be used to paddle things into shape. Later, needle tool. This is an important tool too, and this is very easily substituted with a bamboo skewer, which you can get a pack of these at the dollar store for $1. So they're super cheap, and then you can, have shish kebab for dinner that night. So you can substitute that. You can also use a ballpoint pen, and also a dollar store find, which I love this little paring knife. You get 2 in a pack for $1, so bonus deal. And when our clay starts to get stiffer and harder, cutting with a pin tool is hard because these pin tools, they bend and they break. So I use this for cutting, but you'll also see in the video I use it for moving the clay and manipulating the clay, kind of how I would use a putty knife. They're not sharp, believe me. They came from the dollar store, and once you start working with clay, it takes the edge off really quick because of all the sand and grit in the clay. I love these little dollar store paring knives, and I use those for a lot of things. You're also going to see me use a fork. My rule is that once it comes out of the kitchen, it doesn't go back into the kitchen because it gets covered with clay and it's filthy and disgusting. So I use forks, and you'll see I'm going to use that in the video. We're going to score with a fork, so you're just going to grab a fork. I work with a little rolling pin in the video, and I'd say if you have a rolling pin and you want to use it, you just want to make sure you get this really, really clean, run it, through the dishwasher before it goes back into the kitchen. But you don't have to have a rolling pin. If you have a nice sturdy water bottle, this is one of those metal reusable water bottles, and it has no taper to it, which is nice. This is a great rolling pin. I don't have one with me, but a length of PVC pipe is also a great rolling pin, and so is just a wooden dowel. So anything that you can use to roll out a slab, yeah, go ahead and use it. You don't want to use a cup because they're tapered. They get larger and they go down to like a drinking glass is tapered. But these water bottles are especially effective, and full, they're heavy, and so they help roll out slabs too. So there's some nice substitutions for rolling out slabs. You're also going to see in the video that I use a 19-cent Bic ballpoint pen to do some carving on the clay, and I love this for carving. It's one of my favorite, cheapest tools. Later on in the semester, I can't remember, module 10 or 11, we're actually going to do some carving on wax and soap. And so at that point, I'm going to ask you to buy a carving set, and this is just a very, very cheap carving set. If you want to purchase this now, if you want to do a lot of carving on this clay project as well, you might want to purchase your carving set now, and you can use it on the clay, and then you also have it later on when we get to carving in wax and soap. Trying to think what else. I'm going to talk to you about armatures, so you might need some wire coat hanger. You're going to need some tape. You're going to need some newspaper. One of the methods I'm going to show you, you're going to measure just like it's wood, and so you're going to draw symmetrical, straight, you're going to make geometric figures. That's what I want to say, not symmetrical. Geometric figures, and you're going to need a square and a ruler, just like if you were working with wood. You'll need a straight edge. So you want to have those handy, and then you need a container with a lid. We're going to make the glue that we hold this together is called slip, and we're going to make slip in this, and it needs to have a nice tight fitting lid so that your slip doesn't dry out. So those are all the tools and the substitute for tools that you can use if you don't want to go out and buy a beginner's toolkit. And if you have any questions on this, come see me during my office hours and we can talk about it. Hi everybody, we're getting ready to start on Module 5 where we're working with our air dry clay. And so I want to start this introduction by giving you a couple little things you need to know. First of all, work with a bucket of water, and all your tools, your hands, everything should be rinsed off in that bucket of water, and then you should pitch that bucket of water under a bush out in the gravel or in the alley or something like that. Don't put clay down your sink. Clay clogs pipes badly. So we don't ever want to put clay down our sink. You're also going to need a surface that you can work on that's not sticky. So if you have just a board that you can work on, that's great. It won't stick to that raw wood. Or you can take and you can lay down a cloth like an old pillowcase or something like that. With dry clay, it creates dust, and you don't want to breathe in that dust. That dust is not good for you. We don't have to be manic or crazy about this. You just don't sand anything in a closed room. Don't sand something and do that, because you're blowing all this dust into the air. And your dust has a component in it called silica, which is a very, very small particle, and it gets deep into your lungs and it stays there. When you're outside on a windy day, you're breathing in silica. So like I said, we don't need to have a heart attack over this, but we just don't want to be stupid about it either. So don't create dust, don't blow on it, don't blow it into the air. In its wet form, clay is very safe. It's not going to hurt anybody. And so when in doubt, spritz it. Even if you accidentally blow some into the air, give the air a quick spritz and the water will grab that dust and it'll just pull it right down to the ground. And so as long as you're working with wet clay, it's very, very safe. The one thing you just want to be really careful of is you just don't want to make a lot of dust. That's not good for you. So with that in mind, let's go ahead. Today's video is going to be a little bit long. I'm kind of giving you everything I know about clay in like 40 minutes, whereas normally I get 16 weeks in a semester to teach you all of this. And I'm going to go through it really, really quickly. I wanted to put it in a video so you could go back and you could rewatch different parts of it over and over again. I'm going to give you about 5 or 6 different building techniques. You can use some of them, all of them. You're going to figure it out. You're going to cherry pick whatever you need to get your project done. So what you're going to do is going to be different than what one of your classmates would do. And that's why I'm giving you all these options, because everybody's piece is going to be very individual. And it'll be really interesting to critique, because I'll ask you, well, how did you build that? Did you do a slab or did you do coil? And so we can compare techniques on that. So that's by way of introduction. Let's go ahead and let's get started with clay. For Module 5, we're going to be working with air-dry clay. Just to note on air-dry clay as opposed to regular clay. With regular clay, we put it through a kiln firing process that vitrifies the clay and turns it to a hardened ceramic. With air-dry clay, we're not doing the same thing. With air-dry clay, it's still going to be a little fragile when you're done, and it will not be safe for any kind of food contact. So we do not want to make any kind of containers that we're going to eat or drink from with our air-dry clay. It is strictly for decorative or sculptural purposes, and something that you would set up on a shelf and admire, but not something that you're going to want to handle on a regular basis, because it will break. Let's talk about all clay. The very special property that clay has is that it's sticky when it's wet, and as it dries out, it gets less and less sticky. The second most interesting property of clay is that it's very, very malleable when it's wet, and as it dries out, it gets less and less malleable. It stiffens up. So as it is getting less and less sticky, it's getting more and more structural support. So in its very wet state, it's very sticky, but it has no structure to it. It just falls into a blob. It slumps very easily. As it dries out, it gets less and less sticky, but as it loses water, it also gets stronger and stronger, so you can build bigger and taller structures and have them hold their form. So let's start with some of the basics. Slip is the glue that we're going to use to bind our pieces together. And slip is just a slurry of water and clay. You're going to make your own slip from your clay. You're just going to take and make little teeny pieces of it and drop it into a bowl. And you want something that has a lid so you can keep it airtight. You're going to add water, and you're going to use a fork, and you're just going to mush that around until you get a nice slurry of clay and water. Because it's very, very wet, this clay is very, very sticky, and so it's going to make a really nice glue for us to glue our pieces together. You're going to start by breaking your clay into little chunks, and you're going to drop them into a container that has a lid that can make this airtight. Add a little bit of water to your clay and use a fork and start working that clay into that water. What you want to do is to turn it into a really nice, fine slurry of clay and water that's going to be about the same consistency as sour cream or yogurt. It'll take a while, so just keep working on it. The clay will want to clump together, so you're just going to break it apart until you get a really nice fine slip, and that's going to be the glue that we use to hold our pieces together. One of the first things we want to talk about is the different states that our clay can be in. As our clay is drying out, as it's losing moisture, it's also changing in its flexibility. When you get clay right out of the bag, it's very soft and it's very malleable. There's a lot of things you can do with it, but you can't build very big. You can't go up high because it's so soft it won't hold its form. It has no structural stability. And so if you try and build big all at once with very soft, wet, plasticky clay, your form is going to slump. But one of the nice things about wet plasticky clay is that it's really sticky, and so we can take and we can stick things together just by pushing them together. We don't have to use slip on wet plasticky clay. After we've let our clay dry out a little bit, it crosses over into what we call the soft leather stage. And that's where this is at right now. It's still supple. I can still move it around, but it's got some structural integrity. It'll hold a form. It'll stand up. So that's our soft leather stage. And then we cross over into our hard leather stage. And that's where I'm at with this one. As you can see, it's very boardy. It's lost its flexibility. If I try to bend this board, it'll crack. Okay? So you can't still continue to change the shape of the clay once it's got to hard leather. But what you can do in hard leather is you can work with it like it is a board or like it's cardboard. And you can cut pieces, and then we can use our slip and we can glue them together. So that's just a different way of working with the clay. Also, a wonderful thing that happens at the hard leather stage is that it carves up beautifully at this stage. So if you wanted to do any carving on your clay, this would be the stage that you would do it. And then after all of this, we let our clay go to what we call the bone dry stage. And I don't have a sample of that here, but that's when all the moisture's gone out of the clay. In the hard leather stage, you can still feel the moisture in the clay. It looks wet, even though it's not very malleable. It still looks wet and it feels wet. It feels cold to the touch. Once all the moisture has left the clay, you enter the hard leather, the bone dry stage. And at the bone dry stage, you are done. You can no longer work on it. If you try to carve it, it's just going to crumble. If you try and bend it or change the shape, it's going to break. At that point, it's time to finish it up and call it a day. So now that we know about the different moisture contents of the clay, let's talk about controlling the moisture in our clay. A piece of clay can go from wet plasticky state to bone dry state in a matter of hours, especially here in Arizona where it's so dry. So we want to control the moisture content. We want to release moisture slowly as we pass from one state to the next. Sometimes we get to a certain state with the clay and we want to hold it there. Sometimes we need to walk away from our piece. We get so far, we need to go to work or it's time for bed, and we want to hold it in that state until we can come back to it. So we're going to use a lot of plastic. When we are wrapping our piece up, like we need to put it away for the night and come back to it the next day, we're going to take and wrap it completely in plastic and pretend like this is clay because I don't have anything made just yet. But we're going to wrap it tight to the piece, okay? We're going to go under it, over it, around it. We're going to envelop it in plastic and we're going to have it tight. We don't want it to be in there loose. We don't want any air in here. Even this little bit of air in here can cause your clay to start drying because you have air dry clay. And once it dries, you're kind of stuck. You can't do anything with it. So we want to smush all that air out and we want to really get the plastic skinned right to that clay. You can use dry cleaners plastic or you could use saran wrap, landscaping plastic, anything like that. You can also use plastic bags. Just make sure again that you kind of skin over that and push all the air out. And also, I don't recommend grocery bags. Grocery bags are not sealed tightly. They are not airtight, and grocery bags will leak air copiously. If you have no choice but to use grocery bags or any other kind of retail bag, then you're going to want to triple bag or even quadruple bag your piece in order to ensure that you're not allowing any air in there. Once the air gets in there, it's going to pass from one state to the next, and you're not going to be able to control it. You won't know the next morning when you wake up what state you've crossed into. Now let's talk about when bad things happen to good people. Your piece gets too wet. All right, so now let's talk about what happens if your piece does get too dry. Well, you have a couple different options. The first one is just to simply give it a spritz with a water bottle. And that's not a bad idea as you're working on it either. You know, we're working on it, we have it out and it's in front of us and we're just releasing air all the time. Our hands are dry and our hands are pulling the moisture out of the clay. So it doesn't ever hurt to just give it a quick spritz as you're working on it. If it is really getting too dry, you may have to take some paper towels or a light cloth, you know, like an old pillowcase and an old t-shirt, and you're going to get it damp, not soaking wet, but just damp, wring it out really good. Put the damp cloth over the piece, put the plastic over the piece, mush it all down to the clay so that you're forcing all of the air out, wrap it up really tight, up, down, all the way around. Throw a piece of tape on it if you have to seal it up, and then let it sit in that damp cloth for several hours, even overnight. clay is really good at wicking moisture back and forth. So it'll take the moisture from that cloth and it'll wick it throughout, and it'll even out the moisture content throughout. That's another really good trick too if you're adding wet clay to dry clay. If we're adding a lot of pieces together, doing a lot of slipping and scoring and adding pieces together, it never hurts to get everything wrapped up in a bag and let it sit overnight, and it's going to pass the moisture content back and forth, and the drier pieces are going to get wetter and the wetter pieces are going to get drier, and it very much will want to even out its moisture content throughout if you just give it some time to do that. And so that's always a good idea when you've been adding and embellishing pieces on to the larger sculpture, to go ahead and give it a wrap and let it sit and let it even out that moisture content. Clay is shrinking, remember, and so if you have a really wet piece and a really dry piece and you join them together, the dry piece has already done most of its shrinking and the wet piece hasn't even started yet. So this is going to be shrinking at a much greater rate, and it'll shrink and pull away from the dry piece, and it's going to crack right at that place where you join those two pieces together. So by wrapping that all up really tight, maybe letting it sit and rest overnight, it's going to pass that moisture back and forth, and when you take it out in the morning, it's going to be evenly the moisture is going to be evenly distributed throughout the whole piece, and it's going to just make it a whole lot easier, and you're going to be less prone to cracking that way. Another trick about moisture content is as you're working on the piece, and especially if you're doing a lot of intricate work, you're carving or you're building a lot of little delicate detail work, the whole time it's losing moisture, and it can very quickly cross over. Like for example, the hard leather stage is the best stage to do your carving, but holding at that hard leather stage and not letting it pass over into the bone dry stage is challenging. So oftentimes what I do is I wrap my piece in a plastic bag, and then I only open up and expose the part that I'm working at. And I'll keep moving that opening as I'm working my way around the piece so that I'm only exposing a very small portion at a time to the air so it won't dry out as quickly. And then of course I can give it a quick spritz before I go ahead and I seal it up for the night. What happens when you're done? Now what do? Well, now it's time to take the plastic off. And one of the things you can start by doing, we want to slow down our drying. You know, as it's drying, it's shrinking, right? So we don't want it to dry really fast. We don't want it to shrink really fast because that's going to cause cracks. And cracks are going to be the bane of your existence for the next 2 weeks. Everything we're going to do is going to be to prevent cracks. So one of the things I would do is I would just very gently lay the plastic over my piece. So then now little bits of air can get in, and a little at a time it just slows down the drying. And I'll do that for a day, and then I'll take and I'll drape a piece of cloth over the piece, and then that slows down. The cloth will just absorb a little bit of the moisture as it's released, and that'll slow down the drying. I'll do that for a day or two, and then finally I'll take it off and I'll let it go to completely bone dry. You'll know it's bone dry because it'll get really dry and really chalky looking. You won't feel any moisture in it, and it'll be room temperature. It won't feel cooler than the air temperature in the room. And then when it's bone dry, you're ready to go ahead and finish off the piece, and we'll talk about how you're going to do that later. One more basic thing I want to cover is wall thickness. A thicker piece isn't a better piece, it's just a heavier piece. And being heavier sometimes has its own problems. It's trying to shrink and move all this mass all at once. So we don't want to just make a piece thick because we think that's going to make it better. We want it to be an appropriate thickness, and we don't want to make anything that's thicker than our finger. That's as thick as we want to go. The reason being, if you get something that's really, really thick, it's drying so fast on the outside surface and so slow on the inside surface that you'll start getting a network of really fine cracks on the outside surface as it's shrinking faster than the rest of your wall. There's a way to slow that down. There are certainly people who do it. I'm not saying that it's not possible. I'm saying it's just not practical when we're trying to get a piece finished and ready for critique in 2 weeks. There are people who build huge, big sculptures. People make bricks. How do they do that? Well, they slowly dry these things over weeks of time, which we just don't have. So what we want to do is we want to keep our wall thickness down to where it is no thicker than our finger. So now I want to talk to you really quick about some of the different ways that we work with clay to give you some ideas on what you might do. Before I get started, I set this slab out to dry so it would get stiff and get to the hard leather stage so I could show you that. But what happened is these edges started to get bone dry. And I didn't have anything to show you for bone dry before, and I wanted you to see that's bone dry there. You can see it's very white, chalky, has no moisture left at all, and it's also very fragile. And at this point, we really can't repair it easily. That's why when we get to that bone dry stage, you're just kind of done. So we want to avoid getting to that bone dry stage by accident. We want to wait until we are completely working on our piece. But you can see with the hard leather, it still has some moisture in it. It's darker, it's wetter, it feels wetter. It's also slightly cooler than air temperature as long as it has water in it. Sometimes it's hard to tell with your hand. So if you hold it up to your forearm or even to your face, your hands are very calloused, and so they're not very good judges of those things. But your face and your forearm, that's pretty tender skin. So if you hold it there, you can say, oh yeah, you can feel that it's wet and it's cold. And so if you can't tell by the visual marks of bone dry to hard leather, this is very clearly shows the difference, but you can also feel the moisture content in the clay. All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about the different ways that we work with clay. The first one is a very simple method. It's kind of an ancient method. It's been around for a long time. And that's called the pinch method. And all we're doing is we're just pinching the clay. This is for clay that's wet and plasticky that just came out of the bag. And so it's super malleable. And you probably did this in your grade school, or you did it with Play-Doh, where you just make these little pinch bowls. And you can pinch out any form. You can pinch out a sculptural form, an animal form. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pinch out a couple bowls for you. One of the things you see, I'm going around and I'm pressing the clay here. Anytime we press the clay, we compress it. We take these big round globules of clay and we elongate them, and those platelets start sticking to each other, and it just makes them stiffer and it makes them hold their form a little bit better. I had said earlier, when you're working with soft leather, not soft leather, I'm sorry, if you were working with the wet plasticky, you're never going to be able to build anything really big with wet plasticky clay. You can, however, build parts of the whole with the wet plasticky clay and then let them set up and you can join the pieces together. And I'm going to show you that in just a minute here. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pinch out a couple of these little bowls. I'm going to make them about the same size, and I'm going to set those aside, and then later I'm going to come back to them and I'm going to show you what you can do with them after they've set up to the next stage, which is the soft leather stage. Okay, I'm just going to try and get those to where they're about the same size as each other, and you'll see why in a little bit. I want to make this smaller. It's still nice and soft. I'm just going to pinch it. I'm going to pinch that in because I need it to be smaller so it matches this one a little bit better. All right, I'm going to trim that up so I have a nice smooth area for those two to join. I'm not going to bother making this really pretty just yet. I have a lot more to do to it before it's finished, and I always say pretty comes later. Now, this is just a really simple, quick demo of different forms that you can use, different techniques that you can use to join pieces together. You're not going to do just one of these techniques probably. You're going to use several of these techniques. So you can see I'm going to make a sphere with this, but it's too soft right now. See, it's really soft and malleable. If I tried to push them together, it would just give me headaches because it just won't hold its form. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set those aside. I'll set those aside and then I'll come back to those. The next process that I want to talk to you about is a coil process. With the coil process, we're going to take our clay and we're going to just make a pancake that's going to form our base. And our base can be whatever shape we want it to be. If we're going to make a circular piece, we can have a circular base. If it's going to be an oval, we start with an oval base. If it's going to be amoeba shaped, we start with an amoeba base. I'm going to go ahead and make mine oval just to do something different and fun. And in this process, after we've started with our base, our little pancake, we're just going to take pieces of clay, and I'm just using soft plastic clay right now, and I want to roll coils. And as I'm rolling these coils, I'm using my whole hand to roll these coils. Let me get that base out of my way. And you might have worked this way too. And maybe in grade school you had an art teacher who came in and you did clay and you worked with coils. Now you're going to take your coil and you're going to press it down a little bit at a time into this base that you formed, whatever shape you decided to make it. When I get to this end, I'm just going to wrap up and I'm going to make my second course of clay. okay? I'm going to keep doing that. With this method, because we compress this clay when we roll out these coils, it tends to be a little bit firmer and it lets us build a lot faster. It lets us build about as fast as we can roll out the coils. Sometimes you find, though, that you get about 4 to 6 inches high on a coil built piece, and I'm going to make this smaller. You get 4 to 6 inches and it starts to slump on you. It's still just too wet, and so sometimes you have to take a little time out and let that sit. I will map out, I'm going to go ahead and roll a bunch of coils while I'm talking here. I will map out what my piece is going to look like, and if once I hit that wall at 4 to 6 inches where I can't build anymore, I'll go ahead and I'll start the second section of a pot, and then once my first section has set up to where it'll take the weight of the second one, I can slip and score and I can add that on. And I'm going to show you how to slip and score in a minute, so don't worry about that. And this is true. I want you to think about this with everything that we're doing here, is that you might employ several different methods. You might pinch some pieces together, you might coil some pieces, you might do some slab work. You're going to do whatever you need to do to get the job done. All right, the reason why I would use a coil method is if I needed to build a big structure pretty quickly, then I would be looking at a coil method. I'm going to keep adding on to this. One side is getting bigger than the other, so I think I'm going to go back and bulk up that side. I'm going to get it even. Okay. I'm not going to go too far on this. I want to do just enough to show you how to do it. And then what I'm going to do, because I haven't put any glue in here, I haven't put any slip in here. And let me tell you too, if you're rolling out 1,000,000 coils and you let them sit and they start to cross into soft leather, then you are going to have to put slip between your layers. But as long as you're working with really wet plasticky clay, it'll stick. So I'm gonna try and do this on the side a little bit. I'm going to take and I'm mushing all these coils together to get them to attach, and that's also going to give me a solid wall. And I'm going to do that all the way around on the inside. Now remember, you're acting with one hand and you're supporting with the other. So this is my inside hand. It's supporting as I'm pushing against it with this outside hand. Don't lean it this way. You're going to push that over. You're going to change your shape. Always put your nose above the pot and pull up towards your nose, and that'll keep your pot growing up in this direction. And I'm going to go all along the outside, and I'm going to go ahead and bore you by showing this whole process right now so you can see what that, whoops, now see that coil's coming up. So I want you to see the whole process. I can go sideways. I can take this extra clay and mush that back down to that surface and go back and heel up where I pulled those two coils apart and keep moving. Here I have some coming apart. I'm going to go in and go sideways on that a little bit. Okay, and now I'm going to do the inside. Supporting with my outside hand now, using the end of my rib, flicking over this inside surface. What this is doing, it's marrying all those coils together, and it's also compressing this wall. Every time I compress the clay, I make it stronger. This is why we don't need thick clay. We need really well compressed clay where it's fall flat, and you take, I got a big divot in there. I'm going to push some clay. I don't want to trap any air in there. I'm also going to run my finger all along the inside here. I want to make sure that first course of coils is really firmly affixed to that base. Okay, now, if I was ready, if you can see, look at my walls. They're holding their shape fairly well. They're not great, but I'm going to go ahead and give this a shot. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try another course of coils. This clay I'm working with is a little dry. It's not as malleable as I like, but I'm going to go ahead and suffer through so I can continue with the demo. So when I go to add this next course, I'm going to add it to just to the inside. If I add it to the top or the outside, these things tend to grow really big and they get away from us. So I can keep adding coils and going up. Eventually I'm going to get to the point where if I try to add too many coils too fast, it's going to get heavy and it's going to slump on me. So I either will get to the point where I'm like, okay, I'm done, I can't add any more because it's starting to slump, and then I'll just walk away and let it set up, or I'll set this piece aside, I'll make a second piece, and when the second piece is done, I will take and add the second piece onto the first piece, because by then the first piece will have set up, and it'll be able to take the weight of what comes after it. And then I'm going to go back and I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to go over this and over this. Okay, now we're going to pretend that this is just a really big giant sculpture that I made. I want to talk a little bit about this technique in particular. We want to start finishing the surface before it gets too hard. So after I make sure that everything is stuck together and joined together, I want to start working on finishing off the surface. This is also a great little time management trick. If you've made this piece and it's just too soft for you to add any more on, maybe you've even made a second piece and it's still too soft for you to add the next piece on, then this is a good time for you to go in and do a little housekeeping and start cleaning up these surfaces, because right now it's not very pretty, but we can make it pretty. And you can do that either by just rubbing it with your fingers, rubbing it with your metal rib, scraping the surface. If I can see the inside of your sculpture, whatever you're making for this, that's not stuck out very well, sorry. I was going too fast on this demo. If I can see the inside, you have to finish the inside. You can't leave the inside crappy. You have to finish it. Okay. One of the things I want you to be careful about doing is it's really tempting to take a sponge and just start washing all of this down. But when you do that, you tend to wash away the fine particles and you leave behind the gritty particles in your clay, and it actually gets a little bit rougher as it dries. It might feel good when you do it, but then as it dries, it tends to get a little bit rougher, a little kind of sandpapery. So a little bit of wiping with a sponge is not bad. You can dampen a sponge and go over. Let me just do that real quickly. You know, you could give it a little spritz and use a sponge to go over and clean it up a little bit, and you can see that'll pretty quickly clean that up, which is nice, right, compared to that side. But too much water is just too much water. It's not doing you any favors. Also, as you're introducing water, you're re-wetting your clay, and so if you're waiting for this clay to set up, it can be really frustrating because now you've just re-wet it, and so now you've set yourself back as far as the process where you can go ahead and add some more clay to this surface. So just a cautionary tale on that. And as soon as I can turn this over, I'm going to clean up this edge. I'm going to start cleaning up this outside. It's still awfully soft. I might let this set up for a little bit so I could turn over and clean the outside and get it nice and smooth and clean. So that's where you're going with that piece. All right, I'm back. I have my slip, and I have these two little pots that I pinched out earlier, and I want to talk to you about a trapped air form. We can take pieces and we can put them together, and if we trap the air inside them, we can work with these pieces and they won't collapse. It's okay to trap air inside of these pieces for a short amount of time, and we can use that to our advantage. We don't want to leave that air inside of there. Remember, our pieces are shrinking, and the air pressure will be building up inside of that trapped air form. I'm going to go ahead and work as I'm talking. And if we don't release that air pressure at some point, the piece will crack, and it's going to go find that seam that you just made where you join these pieces together. Now, for this particular one, I'm getting dry enough on this piece that I'm going to score it. And we score pieces when they're starting to get set up. This one I probably could have gotten away without scoring it, especially when it gets to the hard leather stage. We have to score it. But what this does is it scrapes off the drier clay on the outside and gets us down to the wetter clay on the inside. It also gives us some tooth that our slip is going to attach to. And so here's my nice gooey slip. I'm going to take and I'm just going to add that here. And I'm going to use the wetness and the stickiness of the slip to get my pieces to stick together. Okay, I'm going to line these two pieces up. They're not perfect, but that's okay. I'm going to go around and I'm just going to pinch these edges together. And then what I need to do is I need to make this seam disappear. So I'm going to take my rib. I'm going to go back and forth across that seam. I can take that extra clay and put it down into that seam. This is why I told you earlier that I wasn't making it pretty, because I was going to make it really ugly before I make it pretty. But so what I'm doing here is I'm making that seam disappear. I don't want the clay itself, the whole process, to go find that seam. If there's any tension on this piece, it'll go find that seam, and that's where it's going to crack. So that's why I'm going around and really compressing it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a wooden spatula, wooden spoon, and I'm going to compress that seam. And see, I've got air inside of here. I trapped that air when I sealed up that seam. And so now I can paddle it and I can do whatever I want to it, because that air pressure inside is going to hold that up so that it won't collapse. And this is still pretty soft clay. I mean, it wouldn't normally hold up to this type of a beading. It would just be a little mushy thing on the ground. But that air pressure is our friend inside of there. And this is what we call a trapped air form. And it's just a really, really handy little technique when we're trying to build anything really that we want to build it quickly. It can be a square or a circle. If you get a crack, you need to seal that up right away, because you don't want to let that air out. Once you let that air out, you can't keep working with it this way. And then, of course, once again, let me get rid of my mushy stuff here. I'm going to take my metal rib, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go over that seam one more time. This is still very, very soft. And so once again, I'm going to set this aside. Oftentimes, a trapped air form is just one part of a larger piece. So I'll start assembling my pieces. I'll make my trapped air form and I'll set it aside, and I'll make my other pieces and I'll set it aside, and then I'll go back and I'll assemble them together later, scoring and slipping. And I want to do some more cleaning up on this, but just like my coil pot, it's still just really soft. So maybe I let that set up for a little while, and I come to that later and I go ahead and finish cleaning that up with my metal rib. All right, now I want to talk to you about slab process. And we kind of divide it into two categories. We have what we call our soft slab and our hard slab. All right, now I want to talk to you about slab work and about rolling out slabs. We're going to start by just basic slab rolling. I have a pretty nice surface here. This is a unfinished, unvarnished, just plain wood, and so it's not very sticky, and I can usually roll a slab right onto here. If you're working on a varnished surface or a countertop or something like that that's stickier, you may need to lay a cloth down first so that the otherwise you'll roll the slab out onto the surface and it'll just stick and you won't be able to get it back up. Now, we talked about substituting different things. If you don't have a rolling pin, you can substitute a water bottle or something else, or a piece of PVC pipe to go ahead and roll out that slab. Today I do have a rolling pin. It's a rather small rolling pin, and I kind of wanted, I have, really big professional, very expensive rolling pins in my studio, but I wanted to approximate something that you guys would get your hands on. Something you might appropriate from your kitchen, though I will say, if it gets clay all over it, make sure you do a good job cleaning it before it ends up back in your kitchen. Or even, like I said, the rolling it with a water bottle or anything that's not tapered. A length of PVC pipe is great. The first thing you want to do, and this is going to make a lot of noise, but the first thing you want to do is you want to flatten it as much as you can before you start hitting it up with the rolling pin, because the rolling pin is the hardest part of this. And so anything I can do to get this flat to begin with, I'm going to go ahead and do. This also is compressing the clay, so it's all a win-win-win. I'm going to start in the middle of my slab and I'm going to roll out from the middle. I find if I start on this end and roll to this end, my ends get really thin and my middle gets really thick. So if I roll out from the center, I tend to get more even slabs. If a really even slab is important to you, I'm going to show you a hard slab process in just a minute. You can take, these are a couple just wooden yardsticks that you can pick up at Home Depot or I think the dollar store. You could put those on either side of your slab as long as your rolling pin will cross over, and you can use those as a guide to get a nice even slab thickness. Now if you're working with an armature, which I'm going to show you later on, maybe your slab thickness isn't super important to you, but if you're working on a hard slab process, that slab, if this starts to get too wet too, I can put a second piece of cloth over the top of this, and I might in just a minute. But I was saying if you're going to do a hard slab project, maybe you want really, really super even slabs for all of the pieces of that project, in which case you would use rolling pins to help you make that even. I'm going to roll this way and this way, then I'm going to flip it over and roll this way and this way. If we only roll in one direction, the clay shrinks more in that direction than it does in the other directions. And if you took one piece and joined it to another piece, and this one's shrinking this way and this one's shrinking this way, they're going to pull away from each other. So if we, I'm going to get rid of this because I don't really need it. If we roll both sides in both directions, we're going to have less problems. Our platelets are going to line up, and they're going to shrink in the same direction. They're going to shrink more evenly in each direction, I should probably say. And the more you can roll out your slab, the more time you spend, the more you compress it, the better your slab is going to behave. If you start getting warping on your slabs, it's because you mishandled them when you were rolling them out. Once they're compressed, they're a lot easier to pick up without getting finger dents and divots and stuff in them. But also, you know, pick them up with whole hands like this, okay? A slab that's been bent like this is stretched here and compressed here. And you could even kind of see where I compressed it right there. And it's going to remember that. As it's drying, it's going to warp in that area there. So I have to go back and I have to roll that back out if I did that. I have to get it to forget that I did that by rolling it all different directions and try and get rid of that. If it's not going away, I can even add more clay to it and then go back and roll it. But otherwise, if you do that, the slab's going to remember. All right. So now that we've rolled out these beautiful slabs, let's go ahead and talk about the soft slab process. This is where we're going to use a slab and we're going to wrap it around something or slump it into something or hump it over something to help it form a particular shape. This is a great time to texture your slab too, I will say. Anything that you can get your hands on from, you know, different implements, tools. If you have commercial stamps, you can use them. The bottom of your shoes have beautiful tread marks on them that make for great texture. But this is a great time to, if you want to texture your slab, to go ahead and texture it. And that's going to be true whether you do a soft slab or a hard slab project. You always want to texture the clay when it's soft. So I'm going to go ahead and take this clay, and using my water bottle here, I'm going to wrap it around this water bottle because for whatever reason you need to make a cylinder. Now I don't necessarily know how big around this water bottle is. If I have a soft measuring tape, I can measure that, okay? If I don't have a soft measuring tape, I could take this piece of cloth or anything and I can wrap it around and I can say, okay, that's the diameter of my, that's how long it has to be to wrap all the way around it. So I'm going to take this over here and I'm going to roughly mark that on my slab. And I'm going to add, I'm going to go ahead and cut that up here. And I'm going to add a little bit to that just to be on the safe side. When we wrap things around a cylinder, they get bigger. And this isn't exactly even. Let's pretend like I took time and measured this. That's not bad. So you'll see I wrapped a piece of newsprint on here and it's loose so that it slides off. And I just used one little teeny piece of tape. I need this newsprint to release my slab from my surface. A plastic or metal surface, your slab is going to stick to it and we need it to come off. So now I'm going to take my slab, I'm going to wrap it around. So imagine that you could wrap this around a length of PVC pipe. You could wrap this around an oatmeal can. You could wrap this around a soup can. You could wrap this around a 5-gallon bucket if you wanted to make something that big. As a matter of fact, I did that to make a bunch of planters once for a commission. And you can see I overlapped that just a little bit because I'm going to go through at about a 45-degree angle. I'm going to cut through both of those slabs simultaneously. The reason I'm doing that is because now I have this perfect little joint that's going to go back together. This is very soft clay, right? So I'm just going to throw a little slip on there. I don't need to score it. And then when I put these pieces back together, you can see there that they marry together beautifully. Some people like to leave their seams, some people don't. It's really up to you. If you're doing something like really industrial looking, you would leave that seam. If you're doing something really refined, you would get rid of that seam. If you've textured the surface, this would be a time you could go in back over with that texture and add texture in that seam to help disguise it. Don't texture the whole thing at this point. When you press into this clay, you displace clay all the way around where you made that impression. That clay has to go somewhere, right? If you start texturing this clay at this point, it starts bulbing out and getting lumpy and bumpy as it comes away from the container. So the texturing had to be done when it was flat. Now is not the time to texture it, but you can go back and just touch up that texture. And now you put that newsprint in here because you want your container to come out cleanly and be set aside. You want the newspaper to remain with the piece. But then you can go ahead and just with a gentle twist, you can pop that newspaper out. If you have to do several of them, you can take and slip this newspaper right back over that container, and you can just go ahead and do another one. Like if you're doing 4 or 5 or 6 of them for some reason, you could put it around a broom handle or a mop handle. I'm just thinking of all the things you might want to make a cylinder with. And so that's how we make a basic cylinder. Now this is pretty soft. I'm going to hold this with little baby bunny hands because I don't want to dent this. I might even want to take this and set this aside and let that set up a little bit before I act on it. The next option you will want to explore is a hard slab piece. For a hard slab, I've taken the slab and I've let it set out. Now this one is a little soft still, so I might let that sit for a while, but these other pieces have, that one's a little soft too. These pieces here have gotten pretty stiff and pretty hard. You can see if I go to bend them, they just break. All right, that's your hard leather stage, and they're not moving. And when we're working in a hard leather stage, we're going to work this. Generally, we're doing this because we want to make really hard-sided kind of geometric shapes. And when we go to work with these hard slabs, we can cut them with a pin tool. I'm going to switch over to my paring knife. The pin tools, they are kind of cheap and they tend to break. So I'm going to switch over to my paring knife instead. And when we cut them, we can score them and snap them. It's kind of like working with cardboard or wood, or really kind of more like even working with drywall, where you can just do a score and a snap. And so I'll cut this into a couple pieces. If I wanted to go ahead and join these pieces together, now this is really dry, right? I mean, it's still got some moisture in it because we're in the hard leather stage, but I'm going to want to give this a good score. I'm going to add this here, I think. I'm going to give this a good score, and I'm going to give it lots of gooey slip. One of the things I wanted to mention about this slip too is that when we put a lot of gooey slip in, we want to make sure if we've made score marks that we have enough slip that it goes down inside those score marks. And so what happens if we do that right, see how stiff this is? It's really easy for me to work with this. If we do that right, we're going to get all this extra gooey slip that's going to gush out of here, okay? And you want to clean that up right away. If you leave that on that, you have to end up carving it off later, but if you clean it up right away, it just comes off very easily. I can go ahead and I can clean up this edge. Okay, and that's how you can go ahead and build, very similar to how you would build using wood or cardboard or even drywall, because you're working with a very stiff slab. If you're building bigger pieces than this is here, the other thing you'd want to do is roll a little bit of a coil with really soft clay, and you'd want to go ahead and reinforce all these seams with a little coil of soft clay. It's kind of like laying a bead of caulk. But what that's doing is that's going to go in there, and so I would do that, like if I were building a box, I would do that on the inside of all those seams and on the bottom, and that's going to reinforce all of those seams because the clay is not very sticky at this point. We've lost a lot of moisture, and we're adding stickiness right here at the corners, which is great, but a little bit of clay in there to reinforce these corners will go a long way to making sure that this piece moves together, shrinks together, and we end up with a final piece. If these hard slabs fail, they split apart at these seams, and you'll see them sometimes where these seams are flayed open like that. That's a very, very specific problem that happens with these hard slab pieces. That might be because you didn't roll your slab right to begin with and the slab is warping. So what we want to do is we want to do lots of slipping, lots of scoring, and go in and reinforce that with a little coil in the corner, and that should keep those seams from flaying open. I'm going to come back to our soft slab project for just a minute here. It'd be nice if I could let this set up a little bit more, but I want to move on with this demo, so I'm going to go ahead and finish this up. If you need to seal off or put a bottom onto these soft slabs, or you can put a bottom and a top on, you're going to take just a little piece of your leftover slab from when you rolled it out. You're going to set it on there. This is the easiest way to do it. But you're going to mark it, and then I'm going to cut just outside of that mark. It's very difficult for me to place this back in that spot exactly, so I can always give myself a little bit of wiggle room. This is setting up enough that I'd feel more comfortable if I went ahead and I did a little bit of a score on here. I'll slip it. Lots of gooey slip. Make sure you get it all the way down into those score marks. Then I'm going to return my cylinder, center it up on there. Okay, I'm going to give it a little bit of a gentle push. It's still really soft, so I want to be careful. And then I'm going to lift it up. I'm going to just tap it a couple times. Okay, and then I'm going to go along and I'm going to clean all of this up and compress this seam, because I did leave a little bit of excess on there. And so I'm going to spend some time. I'm going to clean this up on the inside, clean this up on the outside. One of the things that I'm looking for is if you have a long-handled brush, a stiff bristled brush, which I should have here somewhere and I can't seem to find right now, that's a great tool to go in there and clean up the inside here. If you have a beginner's toolkit, you're going to see this is also a nice tool to go in and clean up on the inside, but you do want to get in there and clean that slip up. If you leave it, it just becomes a hassle later on. If you clean it up now, it's awesome, it's easy, it just wipes right up. So clean this whole thing up, go over it with your finger, clean it up, make it look pretty, pretend like I did that because I want to move on. So the next thing we want to talk about is armatures. We're going to talk about building with an armature. When we work with regular clay, we have to be really careful because not everything can go in a kiln, right? And so if we have an armature and it gets into the kiln, if it's paper or something like that, it'll burn out. But something like metal like this might melt in the kiln. And so we can do things with air dry clay that we can't do with regular clay. So let's talk about that. An armature is anything that you can layer your clay over that's going to hold the clay up. And it can be really simple. Like you can blow up a balloon, you can lay clay over that balloon and pop the balloon and pull it out. Now your balloon is an armature. Another thing you can do is you can take newspaper and you can just crunch this newspaper up. And you can do this with foil too. I'm going to tell you why I prefer newspaper. But I can crunch this newspaper up. It's going to be noisy. And I can use just a little strip of tape to hold it together. I could put two balls on here like a snowman or whatever and tape those together. And then I can start layering the clay over that. I also want to talk to you about building an actual armature. If you're going to be working with a bigger piece, you may want to start with the base and build on top of that base. We talked about building this structure in Module 4. And so if you need to go back and find out how to do this, at the same time I also showed you how you could do it with a wooden dowel by gluing a wooden dowel into it. So go back to Module 4 and find that video if you want to learn how to make a basic armature. I repurposed this, so I'm going to put that away for right now, and we'll use this one. But you can use this as a basic armature, and that's if you're just building something big and you need it to hold upright. So I would start with this, and then I could add on to this. I could add newspaper onto this. I could ball up newspaper, and I could attach it onto this to change the shape and the form, and then I could start laying the clay over the newsprint. I could also add wire to this. And so if I wanted to take wire and use my snips and go ahead, I need this up higher. Let me see if you can see it better if I do it this way. And I could start wrapping wire around this if I wanted wire to, if I wanted to use the wire as an armature to come off in different directions. I've got a hanger wire here. You know, I could put hanger wire in and I could get that to come off in different directions. I could take a base and drill some holes into it, and I could take my wire, let me go pull out a length of wire, and I could thread my wire through the base thread it through both sides of here and have it come out on the other side, and I could build onto my wire armature here. So what do I mean when I'm building onto my wire armature? You can use paper or you can use aluminum foil, and a lot of people use aluminum foil. It's not my first choice. I tend to work with paper. I like paper because when I ball the paper up, I leave it just loose enough that I can compress it. There's still some air in there, so that as my clay is shrinking and it's compressing, the paper will compress along with it. As it's shrinking, the paper will go ahead and get smaller with the clay. When you use aluminum foil, it's rigid. So as your clay is shrinking, the aluminum foil isn't moving, and so your clay can tend to crack more. So if I'm going to do this, you can choose aluminum foil. People like aluminum foil because it's easier to crunch it up and get it to stick on here. I will use newspaper, and I will use tape. And let me also say, I could add more wire on here using duct tape. And so you can go grab duct tape and you can duct tape wire on here. Whatever you want to do. If you want to flesh these out for some reason, if you want to make them bigger, you can wrap paper around them. And like I said, I do it loosely, and then I can start layering clay on top of there. So what does that look like? Well, once we've decided what our armature is going to look like, now we need to start layering the clay over it. So let me get this out of the way, and I'm going to go back to just that first little ball that I did and show you. Okay, now we're going to go back to that first little newspaper ball that I made. Okay, it looks pretty rough. It's okay, it's going to work. So I'm going to take and kind of mush myself out a little slab here. I'm not really concerned about my slab thickness in this particular instance. You know, I was telling you that on a hard slab project where I'm cutting up those pieces and use them in a very geometric fashion, that is far less forgiving. This is a pretty forgiving process here. So I'm going to I made this into roughly an apple shape. And what I can do is I can just start tearing off pieces of clay and folding it over, and I don't even have to have it hold together all that well, because as soon as I start getting these pieces of clay on here, the clay is going to hold this form together better than the tape. So that's why I was pretty loosey-goosey with this form to begin with. And what I also really love about this process is that once I get all this clay on here, I can push this form around a little bit and change this form as I go, because the newspaper is going to compress. It's going to move with my clay. I'm just very loosely tacking these pieces on, and you'll see pretty is coming. We're just not there yet. Kind of like the trapped air form, I want to make sure I get this sealed up pretty good, because I'm going to start manipulating this pretty quick here. But I'm not depending on trapped air to hold this up. I'm depending on my newspaper to hold this shape. All right, so now I'm going to go over this, and I can start pushing this around. And because that newspaper's in there, there's a lot of give in there. And so I can just start working on my basic shape. If I don't like this, I can just paddle it in. I've got a breach there, so I'm going to grab some soft clay, and I'm just going to layer that in. I also want to tell you, there's a lot of things I'm doing here today that I can do. I get away with air dry clay that you can't do with regular clay. If you are interested in clay, We have lots of ceramics classes here at MCC. I teach an advanced class this semester and in the spring. I've been teaching beginners classes for 16 years, so it's a bit of a change in my schedule, which has been interesting. But we have beginners classes days, evenings, and so if you haven't taken a clay class before, if you had one back in high school and you'd like to revisit that again, I've got this little area, this divot in here, and I'm going to go ahead and cut that. I'm going to lift that out. I don't want to fill that in with clay. I just want it to not be a divot anymore. So I'm going to get rid of it. This clay is really soft. It's fresh out of the bag. I'm not worried about it sticking, so I'm not slipping anything. All right, there we go. And because I've got this newsprint in there and I put it in there so loose, I can just press the clay and the newsprint's going to give underneath as I go. All right, so now I'm going to start going over the surface with my rib. I went ahead and I did the divot for the bottom of my apple. Let's make this look more like a Red Delicious, which is my least favorite apple. Because I do not consider it delicious at all, but it's a pretty iconic shape, so I'm going to work on that iconic apple shape. And this is, you know, if you like modeling, this is like you're modeling with a solid piece of clay. You get that same feeling from it, but of course you've got all this air in the middle with the newspaper, and that's going to help dry your clay out more evenly. And because of the way we're working, we don't have to put this in a kiln. Even if we put it in a kiln, we could leave the newspaper in because the newspaper would burn out in a kiln. When we get over to our metal armature, and I'm going to show you that in just a minute, that we of course could not put in a kiln. So this is kind of the nice thing about working with this air dry clay is we get to skip that whole firing process. But if you take a ceramics class, you will learn, you know, what I've taught you in a very, very short, like, quick on all these different types. You'd spend a lot of time and you'd build a lot of really beautiful things, and you get to do wheel throwing in addition to all of this. So if you have any interest in that, please come join us for a ceramics class here at MCC. We have a very robust ceramics program. We are running hybrid classes right now. There's a crack. I'm just going to, it's a thin spot. I can feel the newspaper popping through. So I'm just going to throw some clay on top of there. Nice wet clay. It's going to let me get away with it. Go over and compress that with a rib and heal that up. All right, so you can see this is starting to get somewhat of an apple shape. It would take some time. I need to do some modeling on it. But that's a way you sort of really quickly get to start developing a shape using a newspaper, just a plain newspaper armature. Now going back to this funky little guy that I was working on, imagine, well, if I wanted to just have things coming off of it like I did here, it's the same type of thing. I'm going to take this apple apart and repurpose this clay. Oh, no, not the apple. Yes, the apple. So I would do this very similar. I would just take these pieces of clay and start layering them over that newsprint, and then manipulating that newsprint. I think I need to get a little bit further up from this. Or maybe I'll do this. I'll work on this one down here. I think it'll be easier to see. So you could go directly onto the wire. You can just lay your clay right onto the wire. The only reason, you want to make sure that your wire is stout enough that it's going to hold up to the weight of the clay, okay? And if you're going to leave this armature in place, if it's going to become a permanent part of your sculpture, you can go ahead and start wrapping that clay onto the armature. You can see what so if you can see what I'm doing here. And so that's one way that you could do it. If you want this to be stouter than it is right now, then you would use the paper and you would wrap it around to kind of beef it up. This is this is an 18 gauge wire, I believe. This isn't quite stout enough. I think I would use a clothes hanger, and I would use that to build up my armature if I was going to be loading a bunch of clay on. I think this will take a lot of clay, but I think a wire coat hanger would probably be a better bet. and I would wrap that around there, and then I'd start building onto that. And that wire coat hanger is going to handle a lot of clay. The other thing you can do, much as remember when we did our soft slab project, this one here, we wrapped newsprint around our water bottle, and then we could go ahead and lift it off. You could also wrap the newsprint around this pipe, or if you used the dowel, around the dowel. And then if you started working this and adding newspaper and bulking it out and layering your clay on, when you had the whole thing done, you could slide it off. And then this armature could be used for something else. I hope that makes sense to you. So we had pinching, coiling, trapped air, soft slab, hard slab, and using an armature. And so those are just some really quick ways that you can build up different elements for your sculpture. And then at that point, maybe you're combining a variety of different elements. And so you took your trapped air form and you slipped and you scored it and you added it to your soft slab cylinder, okay? And maybe that whole thing sits on top of your coiled base. And so this is what I'm talking about, that it's never just one thing. There's never just one way to make a thing. You're going to use a variety of different elements and a variety of different techniques to go ahead and get you to whatever your goal is on this project. Oh, and there was one other thing that I forgot to tell you. I showed you how to wrap a soft slab around a cylinder, but I also wanted to mention that you can slump a soft slab into anything. So if you need something that's bowl-shaped or a half circle, you could pinch it, you could coil it, or you could take a soft slab and you could drop it into a bowl, or you could hump it over the top of a bowl, or anything like that. Anything you can find that you can lay a slab over, just line it with a napkin or a paper towel or something, so that the clay, because the clay is going to stick. It's going to stick to ceramic, it's going to stick to metal, it's going to stick to plastic. So you're always going to put a paper barrier between that and the clay. And you can go ahead and slump that clay into any form or over any form to start creating a shape. And then you would just leave it in that form until it sets up to a nice kind of a stiff soft leather, between soft leather and hard leather, stiff enough that you could go ahead and pick it up and not worry about boogering up your form. So don't forget, you can slump into a form as well. So we spent a lot of times talking about what we're going to do to prevent cracks. We're not going to make our walls too thick, and we're not going to dry it too fast. We're going to support it with coil so that those edges don't flay away from each other. But guess what's going to happen? We're going to get cracks. And I, especially when you're working with armatures, anytime you're working with an inflexible armature, as your clay starts to dry, it's moving, the armature is, and it's going to hit that armature, and it's going to start cracking where it hits that armature. And sometimes it's just worth it. Something that you're trying to make, there's just no other way for you to make your vision other than using a wire or a metal or a wood armature. And so you're just going to accept the fact that you're going to get some cracking. And so we want to talk real quick about what do we do about those cracks and how do we repair them. So we are most often going to start running into cracks the drier that our clay gets. And oftentimes what we're getting are these little hairline cracks like this, and it's really hard for us to get clay down into those hairline cracks. So what we want to do with those hairline cracks, believe it or not, is we want to make them bigger. We want to open up those cracks so that we can get some clay down inside of them. If you have just a little small hairline crack, I'm going to make one here just to show you. Sometimes you can get away with just going on either side of this crack and compressing clay back into the crack. So if it's really small, and if your clay still has some moisture left in it, even if it's pretty bone dry, sometimes you can just do a little compression. But if you have a bigger crack like this one, this clay is actually falling apart, you're going to make that crack a little bit bigger, so you can go ahead and you want to get some slip down in there and re-wet it and get it stickier. And then you're going to take some of your soft plasticky clay and you're going to roll a coil, and you're going to push a coil down in there. Now, the clay that you're repairing is drier than the clay that you're putting in there. And so it doesn't hurt if you leave a little extra clay on the surface of that, so that as it shrinks, it's going to shrink down into the crack, and then later you can go over it with your rib or your paring knife and you can clean up that surface. But just make sure that you really compress the clay down into those cracks as they show up, because that's going to be the real trick to repairing them. I'm going to move back over to this one here. I've got these here. I'm going to open them up. Now with your bone dry, boy, it's fragile at that point, and you want to be really careful. I would try and compress the clay around it and shove dry clay into the dry crack, if you can get away with it. If not, if you have to add clay, add the clay, make the repair, and then go ahead and wrap it back up in plastic. Remember how our clay likes to wick that moisture back and forth and back and forth. When I add this, I'm going to add it a little bit at a time, so I'm pushing the air out in front of it. I don't want to trap air underneath this coil as I'm making this repair. Okay, and I'm going to take that clay to either side. I'm going to go over it. I can use a rib or my paring knife. I've got a little bit extra clay. I can smush it down in there. Anyway, when I'm adding really wet clay to really dry clay, I'm going to want to wrap it back up in plastic, and you may have already unwrapped it from plastic completely and you're letting it go bone dry. You're done, right? And that's when our cracks appear. So we go in and we repair these cracks, and then now we're going to drag that plastic back out, and we're going to go in and we're going to let it dry very, very slowly. We're going to completely wrap it airtight in that plastic for a day or so, and let it dry really slowly and let it wick that moisture back and forth and back and forth. And then when we open it up, we may see another little hairline crack. We might have fixed one crack, one bigger crack, but then as this new wetter clay was shrinking, it pulled away from our bone dry clay, and we'll have to go in and we'll have to repair it again. And you might have to do this a couple times, but be patient. This is why I talk a lot about preventing cracks, because this is a pretty tedious process. This isn't the fun part of working with clay. It's much like when I'm working with the soft clay. I want to handle it very carefully so that I don't make a bunch of finger marks in it. I don't make a bunch of dents in it, because it is really tedious and boring to go back in and clean up all of those finger marks and all of those dents. That's not my favorite part of the job. Just like repairing cracks is my least favorite part of the job, but it happens. So I'm going to do everything I can to prevent those cracks from appearing in the first place, so that I can, spend my time down the line doing something more fun, like maybe painting the piece or somehow embellishing the piece. But certainly you're going to get cracks. It's going to happen. Just, do your best, and then go ahead and make your repair either at the hard leather bone dry stage. That's where you're going to see most of your cracks appear. And so make those repairs, and you might have to make them a couple times, and that's just part of the deal. All right, so we built all our components, and we scored them and we slipped them and we added them all together, and now we need to talk about finishing them. When in doubt, if you're not sure what you want to do, always throw a little coil into all your joints. I showed you that on the hard slab, and it's not limited to just the hard slab. If at any point when you're putting two pieces together you feel like, that could just use a little bit more reinforcement, it's always a good idea to throw a coil in there. A coil can also bridge a gap if you have a direction change that maybe you don't love and you want to bridge that gap in that direction change. You can always throw a little coil in there. So you're going to take all of these things, you're going to put them all together, you're going to finish them off, you're going to use your rib, and you're going to go back and forth over these surfaces, and you're going to get them nice and clean and smooth. You don't have to get this, but one of my favorite tools is a drywall sanding screen. Anybody who's done any home improvement is familiar with this. And once the clay is, especially in its hard leather stage, you can go ahead and sand with that, and that's going to help you smooth it too. But we can always use a little bit of water and just go ahead and use a sponge and sponge off the surface lightly, not a lot of water, just a very light sponging to go ahead and clean up your surface. You're going to clean up all your surfaces, you're going to sponge it, whatever you need to do, slip score, add your coils, you're going to build your piece. So you've got your whole piece built, and now what are you going to do with it? Well, it may not be finished. It may need more stuff. One of the things we didn't talk about is once this gets to the air dry stage, it's completely dry, and you're done with, I mean, you can't, manipulate your pieces anymore. You can still glue things together. Now, you don't want to use your slip at this point because there's just not enough water in your piece for the slip to be effective. But you can take two completely dry, bone dry pieces, and you can glue them together. And I would probably use wood glue, maybe hot glue. I don't know, I'd have to try that and see if it works. And maybe the E6000, but I think certainly a wood glue would work very well, and maybe even a white glue. And you can take two air dry pieces, and you could use a conventional glue, and you could glue those pieces together. So if I was building a form and I wanted to glue something on top of the form, I could, and everything's already dried, and I still want to add things on, I could use a conventional glue to go ahead and add that on. The other thing I can do is I can paint it. So you would want to use just an acrylic craft paint, and you could paint these. You don't have to paint them. You should paint them if painting them furthers your intention. If paint is important in order for it to look finished, or for us to understand what your intention was, then you should paint them. I also want to remind you that as you go along, you can texture these. And one of the things that we haven't done so far is to carve them. And when you get them to the hard leather stage, they carve up beautifully. This is my trapped air form. And don't forget with your trapped air form, at some point you need to poke a hole in it, and so just take a little pin. You just need a little pin prick, just enough to let that air out. But I could also go in here now and I could start carving things out. One of the assignments is to show an inside and an outside, and one of the easy ways is to do that is to carve it. And you need to let it get to that hard leather stage. It needs to be holding its own form. It has to have that structural integrity that you get at the hard leather stage. So you might have to do all your forming at the wet stage or the soft leather stage, and then actually do your carving at the hard leather stage when it's hard enough to hold its own form. If you start carving into a soft leather piece, it's just going to collapse on you. It doesn't have enough structural integrity. So at this point you can carve on it. And you can also carve into it. So you could just carve into the surface if you wanted to do some surface decorating on your piece. So that's another thing that you can do. You can do that with just the end of a knife. I also, when it's especially in the hard leather stage, you can carve with a pencil and or a ballpoint pen. And those are nice because those are tools that we're very used to using. And so they make nice little, great little carving tools for surface embellishment. So you can either carve into the surface or carve all the way through the surface once you get to that hard leather stage. So you've done your carving, you've done your embellishing, you cleaned up your surfaces, everything's, wow, it's beautiful, you don't need to glue anything else on there. You can paint it. You can also take and dilute a little paint and wash the surface. If you dilute acrylic paint, you can kind of wash that surface and you get kind of a watercolor look to it. And so those are just whatever you need to do. Don't embellish the surface just because you feel like, oh, it's not done, I need to do something, That's when you just start bedazzling the heck out of it, and it, ends up looking like a god-awful mess. So don't do it unless it's purposeful, that you have a reason for doing it. If you have a reason for doing it, then you can go mixed media as well. If there are things you need to add to this because it's going to further your intention, by all means add them, glue them on. But like I said, don't just bedazzle the heck out of this because you're lost and you don't know where to go, because, I'm going to call you out on that one. So everything has to be to further your intention. If you go mixed media on this, I still want clay to be the star of the show. This is a clay piece that can be embellished with mixed media pieces. So that is certainly an option. I know that was a lot in one video, and I appreciate your patience. And don't forget, come visit me in office hours if you're struggling or if you have any questions.